They sat me in the overflow seat at the back of the deployment bay, the one bolted in as an afterthought for auditors and equipment reps, and they told me not to touch anything. My intake form read Auxiliary Equipment Handler, which was a translation matrix's best guess at 22 years of pulling people out of collapsed buildings, flooded culverts, and burning scaffolding on a planet nobody at Caldrith had ever heard of. I didn't correct it. Corrections took months here, and I only had the drill. I'd spent most of my working life on a volunteer roster back home, the kind that pages you at 3 in the morning for a car in a river or a roof come down on a family kitchen. You learn to think in triage math whether you want to or not. Who has minutes, who has hours, who's already gone and shouldn't be costing you either. You learn it doesn't matter how confident the plan looks on paper if the water's still rising while you argue about it. None of that transferred to any form Caldrith had a field for, so I sat in the back row in a chair meant for someone checking inventory counts, and I watched. The concordance drill ran once a cohort cycle. 5 simulated disaster sites, real time, real vehicles, staged across a synthetic valley 2 kilometers under the bay floor. The rule that made it a drill worth running, the rule every cadet had memorized before they could walk the launch ramp, was simple. No craft left the bay without an 11-node consensus lattice vote. Not 9, not 10 with an override. 11, synchronized, or the launch clamps didn't release. That was 11th biology as much as it was 11th law. Their nervous systems ran in shared rhythm. Thought passed through the ridge lattice on their collarbones like current through a wire. And a decision made by one of them without the others wasn't a decision. It was a seizure. Cadets who'd tried to act on partial sync, early in their training, described it to me once as trying to speak with half your mouth held shut. They genuinely could not conceive of acting alone the way I couldn't conceive of breathing through my skin. I understood that going in. I want that on the record before anything else. It wasn't cowardice or bureaucracy that kept 20 capable cadets standing at a lattice ring while the clock ran. It was the only kind of decision-making they had ever known how to trust. The alarms hit at 0640, all 5 at once, which was the drill's whole design. A structural collapse at Site 1, with a juvenile trapped under a pressure slab. A thermal runaway at Site 2 eating through a supply depot. A flash surge at Site 3 drowning a low corridor. A second partial collapse at Site 4. And Site 5, which just read comms dark, no other data. Which in my old line of work was always the one that mattered most and got attention last. 20 cadets stood at the lattice ring, collarbone ridges lighting in sequence, pale green, then amber, then a color I didn't have a word for, voting on which site to authorize first. Deployment Marshal Osenrai Vec stood at the center console, watching the vote cycle with the patience of someone who'd run this drill 40 times and knew exactly how long true consensus took under pressure. That was the lesson. The drill wasn't testing whether they could fly the craft. It was testing whether they could hold formation with each other while 5 things burned. 4 minutes in, the vote was still cycling. 11 required, 9 holding steady. 2 ridges flickering between Site 1 and Site 4 and refusing to settle. I'd watched enough real dispatch boards freeze exactly like that. Not from incompetence, from too many good options and not enough clock. I checked my auxiliary handler clearance, which technically listed operator rights on secondary craft for equipment verification runs. Technically. I asked Osenrai Vec if I could take the auxiliary skiff out to confirm site telemetry before full launch, since equipment verification was, after all, my listed function. He glanced at me. 1 beat, ridge flickering a color that might have meant irritation, or might have meant he genuinely didn't register the request as significant, and said yes, fine. Verify telemetry, don't cross the containment line. I crossed the containment line 4 minutes later. Site 1 first, because the juvenile under the pressure slab had the shortest clock. I didn't wait for a full picture. I came in low, killed the skiff's forward momentum against the collapsed debris the way you'd brace a ladder against a burning wall, and went in on foot with a hand jack from the equipment locker I wasn't supposed to have touched. The slab weighed more than the jack was rated for. I shimmed it with debris the way I'd shimmed 1,000 cracked joists back home. Walked the lift instead of forcing it, and had the kid out in under 6 minutes. He was shaking. Dust in his gill slits, one arm held wrong against his chest. I didn't carry him to the skiff. I told him to walk, slow, hand on my shoulder if he needed it, because a kid who can walk should walk, and it keeps him from deciding he's more hurt than he is. Site 2 was fire, which is just physics with an attitude. I didn't fight the thermal runaway head-on. I cut its air instead, sealed the depot's north intake with a foam patch meant for hull breaches, wedged a second patch over a warped vent seam nobody had flagged on the schematic, and let the fire choke itself out over the next 4 minutes while I moved on. You don't watch a fire die, you start the next job and trust the math. I logged the vent seam on a scrap of packing film, because somebody real was going to have to fix that eventually, and I didn't want it forgotten under everything else that morning. Site 3 was the flood, and floods are honest. They only ever go one direction. I found the corridor's low point, because water always finds it for you, and pulled 2 drill-simulated casualties out through a service hatch instead of fighting the current down the main corridor like the scenario clearly wanted. The water was cold enough to matter, thick with sediment the simulation hadn't bothered dressing up, and the second casualty had wedged herself against a support strut in a way that would have broken her wrist if I'd pulled straight instead of rolling her free along the strut's angle. The scoring algorithm hadn't accounted for a service hatch, neither had the cadets apparently in 40 prior runs. Site 4 was another collapse, smaller, a maintenance gantry folded over on itself with 2 workers pinned beneath overlapping beams instead of one clean slab. That kind of tangle usually costs you time deciding which beam to move first, because moving the wrong one settles the load onto the one you needed. I didn't decide. I felt for which beam was still under tension and which had already given, the way you'd read a rope under strain, and pulled the slack one. By then I had a rhythm going that had nothing to do with the Institute's rubric and everything to do with 2 decades of Tuesday nights that never made the news. I cleared it in 3 minutes. Site 5 was still dark when I got there. No telemetry, no structure map, just a beacon pulse from something small and pinned. I found an 11th Cadet drone operator wedged under a training rig that had fallen wrong during the staged collapse. Not part of the scenario, an actual equipment failure. The kind that happens on real jobs and never on paper ones. Her ridge lattice was flickering fast and thin, the kind of signal I recognized from every panicking radio call I'd ever taken, human or not. I didn't wait for her lattice to sync with anything. I got the rig off her, checked her breathing, and carried her out myself, because at that point in a job you stop asking permission from anyone, including yourself. I brought the skiff back into the bay at 07:04. The vote for Site 1 was still open. 9 steady, 2 still flickering between options that no longer existed, because Site 1 had been cleared 28 minutes earlier by a man they'd filed as an equipment handler. Asen Ridge went a color I hadn't seen from him in 3 weeks of watching him run drills. Not the amber of correction, not the green of approval. Something in between that the translation matrix didn't render into words at all. He looked at the skiff's flight log. He looked at the rescued cadet, conscious, walking on her own power toward the medical bench. He looked at me. Nobody spoke for a while. The lattice ring stayed lit but silent, 20 cadets standing in a room that had just watched something happen outside every framework they'd trained inside, and there wasn't a vote for that. There wasn't a procedure that covered a single node acting and being right 5 times running before the rest of the network had finished agreeing on which node should move first. Asen finally said my equipment clearance would need to be reviewed. I told him that was fine, and went to find where they kept the maintenance log, because the skiff's left thruster had been running warm on the return leg, and somebody ought to write that down before it got forgotten in whatever came next. He didn't call it a violation. He didn't call it anything. He just stood there a long moment with his ridge held on that unnamed color, watching me fill in the log in handwriting nobody at Caldrith had ever needed to read before, and let the silence be the only report anyone filed that morning.